Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is February 6, 2022, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's a pleasure to be joined in dialogue by participants from the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. Today we will resume our discussion of the Phaedo, covering from 77c to 98b, in which Socrates, Simmias, and Cebes continue to explore the nature of the soul. Socrates begins with the distinction between the visible composites of physical objects and the invisible non-composite of the soul. Then he counters the arguments of Simmias and Cebes, who say that the soul exists for a limited time only. Simmias says for only one life, while Cebes argues the soul wears out after a number of lives. Their debate takes place, of course, in the hours before Socrates' own soul will be separated from his body, its execution having been prescribed by the Athenian tyranny in their war against wisdom. Death, as Socrates is about to experience, is the separation of soul and body, but his soul, he insists, will continue to exist because it is not composed of parts that can be broken up and scattered to the winds. As always, to focus our discussion, I have suggested three themes, which are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. I'll invite participants to exchange their thoughts on today's reading, and as they do so, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. We can go in any direction the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. To share your thoughts, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. Using the first name from your screen profile, I'll call you to speak in the order that hands are raised, giving precedence to those who haven't spoken before. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome any participants who wish to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So with Phaedo today, we can pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago, with some new ideas and some questions left hanging. If the soul is information, as one participant suggested, how is that data stored, and how do future souls recall the information of past souls? Is there a finite number of souls? In the present, does everything come to be in opposites, as Socrates said? And what do opposites mean with respect to one thing? Does it mean one part negates the other, or does it mean the two limits of a thing's being and non-being? There are some important points that Socrates raises in today's reading that could help in our approach. Each of us is part visible and part invisible, he states, the visible part being the physical body that exists in a state of uncertain knowledge. We reviewed 2 weeks ago the uncertainty principle that governs physics, that the more we know of an object's position, the less we know of its momentum, and vice versa. Today we'll read Socrates' assertions that the ever-changing physical body and its senses confuse the invisible part of us, the soul, which has to make sense of the physical data that it receives from the bodily senses. The soul's task is to determine the causes of physical actions and reactions, and for that it needs to establish the point of equivalence, or the equal, between the opposites of each thing. The soul, Socrates says, is invisible, and there is no changing, increasing, or decreasing of things that are invisible, because they are everywhere equal. Here we will find references to Plato's theory of forms in the context of the unchanging form or nature of each thing. We can ask two questions in determining the nature or form of each thing. First, what is it? And second, what is it not? As Socrates stated at 73c, recollection is triggered by similar and dissimilar, which the soul distinguishes by the point of the equal that divides them. We'll end today's session with a powerful observation by Socrates from 96b to 97e on uncertainty and his search for the mind as the cause. His point may be especially relevant to quantum physics, and I'll propose a practical application of philosophy with respect to the quantum computer bit, an image of which I have in my screen background. We'll resume at 98c in 2 weeks' time in our final of 3 sessions on the Phaedo. So since it leads to a number of themes in today's reading, let's start by considering the definition of wisdom that Socrates offers at 79d and 90c. And as we do this, let's ask ourselves, is this definition complete? Is anything missing? How do you define wisdom? Or to put the question more precisely, how does your soul define wisdom? So I'll put on the screen here the excerpts from 90C to and 79D, and just to bring it back to the previous episode, there was a reference at 69 B, in which they were talking about this idea of finding virtue and exchanging pleasures for pleasures and pains for pains, fears for fears. And Socrates made the statement at 69b that my good Simius, he said, I fear this is not the right exchange to attain virtue, to exchange pleasures for pleasures, pains for pains, and fears for fears, the greater for the less, like coins, but that the only valid currency for which all these things could be exchanged is wisdom. So that was in the previous episode, but here he says a couple of things about wisdom. At 79d, he says, but when the soul investigates by itself, it passes into the realm of what is pure, ever existing, immortal, and unchanging. And being akin to this, it always stays with it whenever it is by itself and can do so. It ceases to stray and remains in the same state as it is in touch with things of the same kind. And its experience then is what is called wisdom. And then at 90c, he says, you know how those in particular who spend their time studying contradiction in the end believe themselves to have become very wise, and that they alone have understood that there is no soundness or reliability in any object or in any argument, but that all exists, simply fluctuates up and down as if it were in the Euripus and does not remain in the same place for any time at all. And so it struck me that, these particular sections, they're giving a definition of wisdom, or at least the Socrates thinks wisdom is, but they do touch on a number of things that we talked about in the last episode, including this idea of things coming to be in opposites, and the question of whether opposites negate each other, or is opposites just two limits of a thing? So does everything have two limits, or does everything negate itself? So that's kind of I think the point that he's making at 90c. And then at 79d, he's talking about wisdom as something that's, kind of more eternal. And so I just wondered, what people think about this definition of wisdom. Is there anything that he has not dealt with here? Is there any other points that you think are relevant to wisdom? I'll just kind of raise a quote that I read from Will Durant, thanks to Jose G, who sent this to me after the last session. Will Durant was a philosopher who wrote, I think, in around the 1930s, and Will said, science gives us knowledge, but only philosophy can give us wisdom. And that made me kind of think of that passage that we looked at towards the end of the last session, in which Socrates says that, as we think, one thought is triggered by the previous thought, and each thought can be either the same or the different from the previous thought. So is knowledge kind of this process of acquiring information, but is wisdom kind of the process of organizing the information into something more permanent? And I guess that's maybe what Socrates might be trying to say at 79d, that something that always stays with it wherever it is by itself and can do so. It ceases to stray and remains in the same state as is in touch with things of the same kind. So what do we think of that definition of wisdom? Is that all there is? Is there something missing? Is your own experience of wisdom different from that? Anybody's thoughts? I guess it's kind of, it's this idea of the eternal kind of nature of a thing. And I think this may be, getting towards what Socrates talks about in terms of the forms. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking that you looking at history and science and so forth, and there's always a sense that we've arrived at the absolute truth, and we've achieved wisdom of some sort. But then we realize that time passes, and then we have to admit that we were wrong. Okay. I think the idea of this that we understand what the immortal and the realm of the unchanging, eternal is a very risky wager that we to make that we can conceptualize it. And maybe that kind of requires also a kind of a negative kind of assertion that maybe the highest truth is that we really can't assert what it is. Perhaps in some religious traditions, that's the approach that they've taken. And I think in Plato also there is a kind of admission that that the ultimate truth is not grasped by the rational understanding, but by resorting to a mythic kind of apprehension.
Or is it that the ultimate truth can be approached through reason, but not necessarily through the senses? Is that more what he's saying, or did I misunderstand what you were saying?
Or is it even grasped by, be understood by reason?
Right.
That's the conundrum, isn't it? That we depend on our reason, but then can the ultimate truth be understood and apprehended by reason? And I think somewhere in parts of Plato there is a kind of that the ultimate truth has to be resorted to by the by mythology.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes me think. Actually, I was looking back yesterday at Phaedrus and this idea of our communicating with each other, and the truth arising in some sort of back and forth dialectical process where we kind of move towards the first principles of a thing. And so, yeah, I think that idea of communication that you talked about is interesting, and certainly, this idea that what we take in with the senses is subject to some distortion and confusion. And I think we talked about that last time in terms of the uncertainty principle, that the more you know of a thing's position, the less you know about its momentum, and vice versa. So we can never have absolute knowledge of physical objects. And certainly Socrates goes to great lengths in this section that we're reading today and in the section before 2 weeks ago to present this confusion that the senses provide us. So, interesting, that idea of the negative assertion that you talked about, JK, that the absolute truth can't be asserted. So that's an interesting idea, and let's explore that in terms of people's conception of wisdom. So we'll go to Steve and then Joel. Steve?
So when I read these two sections, excuse me, it made me think quite a bit, and along the lines of what's been said. When I look at 90C, and it's studying contradictions in the end, those who study contradictions and believe themselves to have become wise, that they alone have understood there is no soundness or reliability in any object. And then the 79D says the soul investigates by itself. So it itself passes into the realm of what is pure, everlasting, immortal. So I'm looking at the soul investigates. So how, if the soul doesn't investigate by studying contradictions or by studying how does the soul investigate by itself to pass into this realm? And what you were just saying, Jason, maybe it's a question, if I understood what you were saying, is it is using the feedback loop to get closer and closer to some, maybe you can't obtain the ultimate truth, but maybe you can get yourself a little bit closer. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's the thoughts that came up for me.
And appreciate that idea that, you use the word feedback loop, and I guess feedback loop is something to me where you put in you put an input and you get the same output all the time. So the input becomes the output, becomes the input, becomes the output. And I think that's maybe a little bit different from what Socrates is trying to say in terms of finding the equal in things.
Can I expand on what I said?
Yeah, by all means, yeah.
So I'm thinking more in, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm thinking in way of the idea of the free energy principle, that when you do something, even if you're wrong, you get feedback and then you're able to correct. So now you're working, instead of, 50-50, if you're picking between six, looking for a black spot out of six spots, and you choose one and you're wrong, now you're getting closer and closer. So it's not feedback as it's always the same. Ultimate reality is always the same. The physical universe is always the same. But this free energy, as I understand it, is you're improving your ability to function in the world by getting that feedback. I don't know if that's explains what I'm. Does that resonate in what I'm saying a little better?
Yeah. I think I understand, and it's. I think what you're saying, as I understand it, is this kind of idea of testing probabilities and then eliminating the things that are improbable to get closer to the things that are probable. I think if I understand what you're saying correctly.
Right, as a way of gaining wisdom. So it is studying contradictions in order to become wiser.
And that's a good way of putting it. I think the one thing about contradictions, just to talk about what Socrates is addressing here at 90C, is it's one thing to know what something is not, but another thing to know what it is. And that's what I'm thinking when there was that discussion in the last episode about the equal, finding the equal, and everything coming to be in opposites. And I think it was Jose G last time who corrected or suggested that when a thing comes to be in opposites, it's not negating itself. It's just that it's establishing two limits. So everything comes to be with two limits. And as I was rereading this, it made me think that the two limits are the being of a thing and the non-being of a thing. So that everything has a limit of its being, of its existence, and a limit of its non-being. And so the equal is that point that's right in the middle of the things being and the things non-being. And at that point in the middle, I think, as you said, Steve, that's the point where you're kind of, you've tested all the probabilities and you've arrived at that point that says, okay, I know exactly where the thing begins and where it ends. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's to me what the equal means, finding the equal. And that's where the soul's job comes into play, where the physical sense is that equivalence of things is not accessible to the physical senses because of the uncertainty principle. And so I don't know what you think about that or what others think about that. We can go to Joel.
Hey, so my question is more or less just to ask for some clarification. It's related to both what Steve said earlier as well as what's stated in 79D. My question specifically is just a few sentences back around 79A, and if you'll just give me 10 seconds, I'll read it out. Do you then want us to assume two kinds of existence, the visible and the invisible? Let us assume this, and the invisible always remains the same, whereas the visible never does. Let us assume that too. Now, one part of ourselves is the body and another part is the soul. So my question specifically is like we're talking about characteristics of what the soul is more or less capable of doing and verifying. So, what exactly this part here is, and the invisible always remains the same, whereas the visible never does. How is that established? How can you tell the difference between something that is invisible and never changes versus, say, just nothing? Exactly. Does that make sense?
I think it's a good question. And I'd ask everybody else to weigh in on this. When I think of the visible, I think of the physical objects, and every physical object, I think we now know, is made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of quarks. And, so every physical object is composed of parts. And each part is different. And every part in a physical object is always in motion, is always in change. So no physical object remains the same. Because of this constant motion of the physical objects. And the invisible, though, when I think about it, the only thing I can equate it to is the vacuum of outer space. This idea of this vacuum with absolutely nothing in it. And if you were in that vacuum in outer space, you couldn't pick out one point from another point. I mean, it would be completely just equal. It's as if it's just this sea of nothingness. And there is no changing in that sea of nothingness. It's just, there is no difference between any of the points in it. That's kind of the way I think about the invisible in my mind. And then certainly, I guess what you've pointed to here is, kind of the end of the first reading, that it's kind of where I think we can go maybe in terms of thinking about the idea of the forms. This kind of unchanging existence of something, of a thing, and the only place you can get no change is in the invisible. Certainly not in the visible, where everything is always changing. But I think it's a very good point. And I use that kind of analogy of the vacuum of outer space to deal with, kind of conceptualizing the invisible. And, certainly the invisible, certainly whatever motivating force is inside us, the soul, call it, that is not visible. Like, nobody's ever seen a soul. So, I would ask, does everybody accept that idea that there are things that are invisible? Or do we think that there is some way of eventually seeing the soul, that everything is eventually visible? Maybe this gets to the nature of knowledge too, in this question of whether knowledge is derived empirically through the physical senses, or is some knowledge derived by means other than looking at what is visible? So you raised a whole host of questions, Joel, so thank you for that. And I don't know if I've answered any of them, but I think we can look to others to help with that. So we'll go to JK and then to Steve.
Yeah. So can you think of the visible and the invisible as like being and non-being? And so that being is everything that you can see and perceive and maybe even conceptualize as things that exist, that being in the world. And even energy could be conceptualized as that too, as being. But non-being would be, that which you cannot even conceptualize and see and conceptualize, but that there is there is something there, which could be the source of what being is, but it's not able to be conceptualized or understood. And so that's why in some religious traditions, philosophical traditions, they've used the negative assertion that once you are able to assert or conceptualize and posit that God is this, that's not what God is. or in a Taoist tradition, the Tao can be the Tao is that which cannot be said or conceived, right? So you can try to say, if you think that the Tao is that's not what it is.
Mm.
So I don't know if you can think about that. Also, is the equilibrium between being and not being, becoming?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you raised some good thoughts there. And that's the way I see that equilibrium. That equal point between being and non-being. That's the point that occupies the present, and that's the state of becoming. So it's neither being nor non-being. The present is that point of potential where either could exist. And that's the point in our minds that we have to decide, whether we want to, go towards the existence of something or the non-existence of something. But I like the way that you equated visible with being and invisible with non-being. I think that could be helpful. And we can see what others think about that. And certainly your idea of the equal being that state of becoming, that point of neither existence nor non-existence of something. So thank you for that. And Steve, your thoughts?
Speaking of religious traditions, what you just said made me think of Nagarjuna's tetralemma, where there's four posits: being, non-being, and then you're both being and not being, and you're neither being nor non-being. So, my earlier thought was about the example of space, being an example of the invisible. And you think about, energy or electricity is invisible, but it still is a thing. But that seems too, maybe on a gross level. But if you think even of just information, information, it would seem to be physical, even though it is invisible. Like, I'll stop there. That was my thought.
I think that was very helpful. Those four states of things, being, non-being, both, or neither. And I think that I don't know a lot about information science, but I think that those four possible states could relate a lot to the way we process information in computers. And so this may actually have quite a good relevance actually to the end of today's session, where we look at 97 or 96 and 97 in particular in this, in terms of understanding the potential states of something. So I think that's really helpful. And certainly it really helps us to get to this idea of the equal, and what's being talked about. And it makes me recall that when we talked about the syllabus, I think it was 4 weeks ago, we started by talking about that example of what they're trying to do now with information science and feeding data into machines and trying to train the machines on what a thing is. And we saw that terrible example that occurred, I think it was in 2015, where an image of two Black people was presented, and Google's computer labeled them as gorillas, because the computer had only been told what gorillas are, but the computer does not know what gorillas are not. And it makes me think that maybe it's easier, or it's more available to us to program into the machines what something is, but what a thing is not is far greater in potential than what a thing is. And so really, if you're going to do a complete training of the machines, you can't just say what a gorilla is, for example. You have to say all of the things that a gorilla is not. And clearly a gorilla was not what was in that picture. And, this could really call into question, I think, the approach that we're applying to identifying, using machines to identify things. And it's something that, I'm considering in the idea of set theory. Bertrand Russell was, I think, very well-known philosopher, of course, and about 100 years ago. And he was really talking about set theory. And the question is, what is the set of a thing? Is a set of a thing both what it is and what it is not? Or is something just what it is? I think maybe that's the point that we need to address, and maybe that's what Socrates is talking about in terms of wisdom. So it's a very helpful point. Are there any other thoughts about wisdom? As I said, I wanted to start with this idea of wisdom because I think it really does touch on a lot of things in Phaedo, and in particular in today's reading. Maybe we can look at this one reading here, since Joel actually brought up the end of this reading. So maybe we can just take a look at this section here from 78b to 79a. And this talks about the visible and the invisible, which we've already started talking about. It also raises the terms composite and non-composite. And as Socrates describes it, the composite are things that are composed of parts. They're made up of parts, so they're called composites, composed of parts. Or compounds is the other word that he uses. And then he contrasts that to the non-composite, something that has no parts. And the invisible has no parts. That analogy that I use in my mind of the vacuum of outer space. There are no parts. Everywhere is the same. And he winds up by concluding that everything physical is a composite. It's made up of parts, but the soul is a non-composite. There are no parts to the soul. The soul is everywhere equal. And so the dialogue goes on to say that the soul is always looking for its equal, which is in this realm of the non-composites, the realm of the invisible, where there is no difference. I think it's actually to me, it seems like a very powerful conception of the soul. The non-composite being a lot more powerful in a way than the composites. And in fact, he says that nature is set up so that the non-composite rules the composite. And I think that's, to me, it's a very powerful and empowering idea. So maybe we can just read this section. I don't know if we have any volunteers for Socrates and Cebes. I could do Socrates if somebody wants to do Cebes.
We Cebes.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll just start then. So again, this is 78b to 79a. Socrates starts off by saying, we must then ask ourselves something like this: what kind of thing is likely to be scattered? On behalf of what kind of thing should one fear this, and for what kind of thing should one not fear it? Should we then examine to which class the soul belongs, and as a result either fear for the soul or be of good cheer?
What you say is true.
Is not anything that is composite and a compound by nature liable to be split up into its component parts, and only that which is non-composite, if anything, is not likely to be split up?
I think that is the case.
Are not the things that always remain the same and in the same state most likely not to be composite, whereas those that vary from one time to another and are never the same, composite?
I think that is so.
Let us then return to those things with which we were dealing earlier, to that reality of whose existence we are giving an account in our questions and answers. Are they ever the same and in the same state, or do they vary from one time to another? Can the equal itself, the beautiful itself, each thing in itself, the real, ever be affected by any change whatever? Or does each of them that really is, being uniform by itself, remain the same and never in any way tolerate any change whatever?
It must remain the same and in the same state, Socrates.
What are the many beautiful particulars, be they men, horses, clothes, or other such things, or the many equal particulars, and all those which bear the same name as those others? do they remain the same, or in total contrast to those other realities, one might say, never in any way remain the same as themselves or in relation to each other?
The latter is the case. They are never in the same state.
These latter you could touch and see and perceive with the other senses, but those that always remain the same can be grasped only by the reasoning power of the mind. They are not seen, but are invisible.
That is altogether true, he said.
You then want us to assume two kinds of existences, the visible and the invisible?
Let us assume this.
And the invisible always remains the same, whereas the visible never does?
Let us assume that too.
Well, thank you. So in that section, this is where Socrates was kind of addressing this concern that the soul on death would just scatter to the winds and never exist after that point. And so the argument starts off with this idea that something that is non-composite doesn't have parts, like the soul, can't be scattered. Whereas something that's a composite has parts, then you can scatter the parts. But if there are no parts, there is no scattering. So this fear that when you die, the soul disappears, scatters to the winds, especially so in a strong wind, I think, as he said in the section that we read 2 weeks ago. Socrates is saying, well, we shouldn't have this fear because there's nothing to be scattered. So that's how this section comes about. But I think the one interesting thing that really talks about the forms to me, this theory of the forms, is this paragraph when Socrates says, let us then return to those things with which we were dealing earlier, to the reality of whose existence we are giving an account in our questions and answers. Are they ever the same and in the same state, or do they vary from one time to another? Can the equal itself, the beautiful itself, each thing in itself, the real, ever be affected by any change whatever? Or does each of them that really is, being uniform in itself, remain the same and never in any way tolerate any change whatever? The word uniform particularly struck me there because it contains the word form, uniform, one form. And, it really, to me, it's this idea that the form is the thing from its beginning to its end, from its being to its non-being. And, just I wonder how that kind of ties into this idea of wisdom. Is it the idea of looking for the essence of something from its beginning to end and finding that essence? Is that what wisdom is? Whereas knowledge is just feeding us details about, the variances, the many particulars that a thing can appear in. But wisdom is actually taking that knowledge and combining all of that to find really it's almost like a first principle, isn't it? Of a thing. I just wondered if that struck anybody, that particular part of it. JK?
I just have a question about this idea of uniform and meaning one form. But Plato, we understand, is talking about forms, right? He has a theory of forms. Are there many forms that, or are they kind of like subforms of the one main form?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it makes me think. Again, as I was reviewing the Republic yesterday, he talked, for example, about the good. The form of the good, that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower, is how he defined the form of the good. But then he talked about the form of the beautiful in the Republic as well. And he said that the beautiful is a form in itself, but it's lesser it's a lesser type of form than the form of the good. So in a way, it's a subform. So the good, I think he really placed prime among the forms in the Republic. But the other forms, like the beautiful, so the beautiful is something into itself. And I think the key is this idea of something by itself. So something that doesn't require reference to anything else to exist, that makes it a form. I don't know if that makes it
Yeah.
That makes
Well,
sense.
what makes it more clarifying for me is Spinoza's idea of substance, that there is only one substance, one form, but there are attributes of that substance, and then we are, existing modes of those of the original substance.
Interesting idea. I haven't read Spinoza. I don't know if anybody else has, although I think I understand some of the themes that he addresses. I'm wondering, substance, is that something that's subject to definition? Whereas forms, in terms of Plato, and especially as I reread Phaedrus, and I'm just looking actually for, here I took an excerpt of it here. In Phaedrus, at 249c, he said, but a soul that never saw the truth cannot take a human shape, since a human being must understand speech in terms of general forms, proceeding to bring many perceptions together into a reasoned unity. That's what he said at 249c in Phaedrus. And it made me think that the forms are almost a way of communicating. Whereas I don't know what Spinoza says about substances, but is substance something that is already defined and not subject to our definition in dialogue with each other? Whereas I think Plato is more talking about the way we define a thing. So I think I used an example in my introduction to the previous episode about a teacup, for example. I might define a teacup one way and you might define it another. Like I might use a coffee mug to drink my tea from, and that would still work as a teacup, but you might use something different to drink tea from. So, how do we define the form of teacup? It's subject to this kind of variability maybe, but somehow it's in our back and forth, our definition, that there are some common properties to the thing. So I don't know what people think about that idea. It's an interesting thought, the use of Spinoza there.
Well, for Spinoza, the substance, is God and nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's only one, just like he's saying here, there's only one form, one soul. It's a uniform, and everything is instantiated from that one substance, one form, and everything takes on, is an attribute or is a mode of that original form.
Mm.
Yeah, substance.
Okay. So maybe the soul is more like the substance, and then the things that surround the soul could be forms.
Yeah. Well, with Spinoza, everything, underlying everything within everything is a soul, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah. That's. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things here that's struck me too is this part where Socrates says, "They're not the things that always remain the same and in the same state, most likely not to be composite, where those that vary from one time to another and are never the same are composites." And so this idea of being in the same state reminded me of Theaetetus, where he talked about change in state as being a form of motion. So motion is not just a change in spatial position, but it's also a change in state. And so, we need to understand that a thing can change in state over time, but that the form of a thing could be the same, even as it's changing. For example, there was the example of a bed, for example. So, there's this form of a bed. A bed is a certain thing, but it takes many different shapes and many different modes of existence. It takes many different states. So, it's, I don't know what to. I think it's very helpful to raise these questions.
Yeah. Well, you can also think of Einstein's formula of the E equals m2 square. Right? Is it E equals m square? Right?
E equals mc squared.
MC squared. Okay, so
Yeah.
so that would be like everything. All matter is really basically energy. But once matter breaks down, it becomes pure energy.
Mm-hmm.
So you could think like that. So energy could be something like behind energy might be the form, or
Actually, it's an interesting question, and certainly that equation uses the equal in it, right? E equals mc
right.
squared. So this idea of equal. So energy could be either in its pure form, or it could be in the form of a physical mass, right? Mass having resistance at the speed of light, which is the speed limit in the fabric of space-time. So energy could take either physical form or non-physical form, with the equal between it. And that's maybe an interesting way of thinking about the equal, and finding that distinction between energy and its equivalent, mass at the speed of light squared.
Right. So you could think of energy as just pervasive in the universe, and it is invisible, right, in a sense. Right? And you could but it can be measurable in terms of matter.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. We'll go to Jose. Your thoughts, Jose?
Yes, I was looking at some definitions of wisdom, and the way that I can see is that knowledge, you have knowledge. When you have knowledge, you have information, and you can explain the why and the how, etc. So this is when you know things. So now the difference with wisdom is that wisdom is how to apply knowledge to take good decisions in your life. So, and from the ancient Greeks point of view, Plato or Aristotle is how to apply wisdom is how to apply the knowledge to get to happiness or to get to virtue. So this is why I think he gives so wisdom is a way to, when you see the forms, you know the truth of the forms, like the beauty, the good, etc. You get the wisdom, because then you can apply that to live a good life, a life of virtue, a life of truth.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's the way something can be used to a desired end.
Yes.
Yeah, and in the Republic we saw the soul being divided into three parts: the spirit and the appetites or desires being kind of governed or mediated by reason. And maybe it's understanding the form or the truth of something, and being able to apply that reason to achieve an end that appeals equally to reason, to spirit, and to the appetite. And maybe that leads to happiness. And actually, you raised the word happy, and that actually appears in 81a, today's reading, talking about this is again going back to Socrates saying that the job of a philosopher is to practice for dying, which we saw last time as well. So at 81a, he says that it's practicing philosophy in the right way, in fact, is training to die easily. Or is this not training for death, he asks. And the answer is, it certainly is. It surely is. And then he says, a soul in this state makes its way to the invisible, which is like itself, the divine and immortal and wise. And arriving there, it can be happy, having rid itself of confusion, ignorance, fear, violent desires, and the other human ills, and, as is said of the initiates, truly spend the rest of time with the gods. So there's that idea of happiness there as being out of this state of ignorance and confusion. And he certainly goes to a great extent to talk about how confused we get when we just rely on the senses. And it maybe goes back to that question I asked near the beginning as to whether knowledge can only be derived from empirical evidence. Is all knowledge that comes to us purely from the senses, or does knowledge come to us from other sources? And here, I think Socrates is saying that knowledge, if we just rely on knowledge that comes from the senses, we are not happy, because there is that confusion, and we don't understand the true purpose or the true potential, maybe, of something.
Well, this is yeah, but the point is that knowledge, even for whatever means, is not enough to have knowledge.
Right.
You have to know, like wisdom is how to apply this knowledge in reaching what you say the goal, and the goal for the Greek is happiness, virtue.
Right. Yeah, and maybe it's also a question of is knowledge, does knowledge answer the question how something is done, but wisdom maybe addresses the question why.
No, I think how to apply.
Right.
Wisdom is how to apply in your
right.
decisions.
But how to apply? But how to apply for what purpose, and why that goal exists, right? Because it's maybe a question of why one would have one goal over another goal. Would that make sense?
I think knowledge implies the why of things, because you have information, is level one, yes, information. So now, when you have knowledge, is that you can tie up this information, making know the why and the how of things. But the next level is wisdom, how to apply this knowledge to reach really happiness or virtue.
Right. So, like, knowledge is power, but wisdom is how you apply that power in order to live. Right. Yeah. Wisdom is knowing how to live.
How to live, yes.
Right.
How to reach.
Right.
So then, in order to know how to apply this knowledge, this is one way is to go to the world of the forms and know the forms, because you know what is really is the beauty and the justice and all these things.
Yeah, it seems like he's saying that if wisdom is knowing how to die by understanding what death is, and then you're able to know how to live a meaningful life, because you know how to die. You know what death means.
And death here again, Socrates has defined death in the section we read 2 weeks ago as the separation of soul from the body. And I guess I kind of envision that as the soul kind of reaching its point of equivalence, and maybe go to that question or speak to that question that was left hanging last time, as to whether there is a finite number of souls, or whether, in fact, if all souls belong to this realm of the invisible, non-composite, is there any definition? Is there any concept of limits in that realm, or is it inherently without limit or infinite?
Would that also mean that there's not a personal soul?
Right. So individual souls, I guess, can have limits, right? They would have to have limits, and certainly in time.
Sure.
But
it looks like they recycle the souls according to how you behave. You can go even to an animal. Right. Say that the people that they are unjust, they go to a wolf.
Right.
And even but the person that they were, how do you say, they didn't have virtue, because they didn't know, but they were okay, but they weren't philosophers. They can reincarnate in other people.
Yeah, so, but if a soul is non-composite, it's uniform, then there's no distinction then, right, among different souls.
Well, the interesting thing, and it's if we go, back at the end of the Republic, was that story of and we didn't have a lot of time to spend by the point that we got to that. But the story of was this story of who died in battle and went up to the realm of the souls, and he was brought back to life, and so he was able to tell his tale. And when he was in the realm of the souls, he said that the souls themselves weren't recycled, but what was done is, as the souls came into this realm of souls, the models of lives were placed on the ground before them. There were far more of them, in other words, the models of different lives, than there were of souls present. So at any point, there's a certain number of souls present, the number of people who have died and are waiting assignment to a new life. And all of these models of lives are placed in front of them, and included in these models were, lives of tyrants, and so it was the soul's choice to choose which kind of life it wanted to lead in its next physical incarnation. And it was actually very explicit in that, and said that the gods could not choose. The soul has to choose which kind of life it wants to lead in the next physical incarnation. And I thought that was actually a pretty powerful idea, that the soul alone has that choice to make. So individual souls aren't recycled, like they don't disappear and are reformed as a different individual entity. The kind of individual soul remains in place. It forgets, but it remains intact, and it has to choose what it wants in the next life. And it somehow does this through some process of recollection, which Socrates talks about, certainly in the Phaedo, is this idea of recollection, and one soul kind of remembering what it knew in the past.
So you would choose what you're familiar with?
So you would choose, I think in the story of he's saying you would choose based on your learning. So in a previous life, if you had learned to be a philosopher, for example, you would choose a better life than somebody who had never learned those values. Somebody who never learned that might, and he actually gives an example of somebody who mistakenly chooses the life of a tyrant. Because he never learned in a past life that these bad things could happen. So he just learned that, pleasure leads to more pleasure. And so why not be a tyrant? And in the story of the choice was made, and it was too late then to change it. Once the choice had been made, the three fates then weave that soul into the next physical body, and he couldn't go back after that point. But so that the soul, each time it lives, has to learn certain things so that it prepares itself for the next life. Joel, what are your thoughts?
So if you're presupposing that the soul carries on after death, does that also simultaneously saying that, like, say, for example, we'll use me, for example, have I always existed even in the past, essentially? And if information or knowledge somehow carries on, then why is it that, I don't know, none of us have any recollection of the past before we even existed? So if we carry on in the next life somehow, and if it's eternal, then why is the past just a black box that doesn't? Does that make sense?
It does. So you're asking why does the soul forget between its different lives?
You say forget.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, he addresses that very specifically in the myth of or the story of I don't know if it's a myth. I would call it a story because I don't think it's been disproven. And he actually says specifically, I'm just looking for it. The reason this forgetfulness occurs, and he actually refers to it as drinking from the, looking for the words, drinking from the fountain of forgetfulness or something. But the reason that occurs is it's what allows for differences to occur in the next life. So that, for example, if a tyrant were to die and were to choose again to be a tyrant in the next life, then that would get almost into this kind of feedback loop, not in the sense that Steve was talking about earlier, but in the sense that I think of a feedback loop is it's the same input produces the same output all of the time. So this forgetfulness is there so that each time the soul comes into a new body, it has a chance to change and to improve, hopefully. Sometimes it doesn't, but I think that's exactly why he says that there is this forgetfulness. And so each time a new person comes into being, the Joel that exists now has a chance to do different things from the Joel that existed previously.
It was very much like a Hindu reincarnation thing going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah. So I find it empowering, actually. I think the idea of coming to life every time and being the same as you were in the previous life, I don't see what the point of that would be. Certainly there was talk, I think we saw this in the Republic again, where, if a soul was bad in one life, it's going to pay the penalty 10 times over for the badness that it did in its previous life. It has to learn. It has to learn. So there's that penalty. But if it was good in a previous life, then it reaps the rewards in the next life. So there's always that reward and punishment element in the reincarnation process. So I wanted to maybe just go to this part, this argument between, well, not an argument, but it was a debate, I guess, between Simmias and Cebes and Socrates. And I'll just highlight from 91b to 96a, there's a rather lengthy passage there, but the idea of cause and, what causes this process of generation and regeneration in the souls, and and also in the length the soul has to exist. And so Socrates, again, has said soul goes on forever; it never stops existing. Cebes, sorry, just looking for the section here. Yeah, so he summarizes here the arguments at the beginning. He says, "We must proceed and first remind me of what you said, if I do not appear to remember it. So Simmias, as I believe, is in doubt and fear that the soul, though it is more divine and beautiful than the body, yet predeceases it, being a kind of harmony." So Simmias has said that the soul is like a harmony. It plays once, and then once the body dies, it's like the orchestra dies. There's no more harmony. So the soul has one chance to do its harmony, and then it disappears. And so Socrates continues on. Cebes, I thought, agrees with me that the soul lasts much longer than the body, that no one knows whether the soul often wears out many bodies, and then, on leaving its last body, is now itself destroyed. This then is death, the destruction of the soul, since the body is always being destroyed. So Cebes has compared the soul to a cloak, and the soul weaves this cloak. The body wears the cloak, and the soul can continue weaving more and more cloaks. Every time the body needs a new cloak and the cloak has worn out, the soul can continue weaving more cloaks. But every time the soul is reborn, it's damaged just a little bit more. And so after this continuous process of rebirth, the soul just gets so damaged that it can no longer weave any more cloaks. And so at one point, the body wears its final cloak, and the soul is just so damaged it can't build any more cloaks. And, I don't know if this idea of continual damage, where I guess maybe is it the idea maybe that we're born into sin, and we damage the soul, and the soul is this pure thing that's just born into damage every time. And so I think Socrates is trying to say that that's not the case, that the soul is always pure. The soul doesn't have different types of harmonies. It doesn't have a good harmony. It doesn't have a bad harmony. It doesn't wear out. It just, again, it's in this realm of the non-composite, the invisible, something that's just always the same. It never changes. And he ends this section by saying, we've previously agreed that one soul is not more and not less than a soul than another. In other words, all souls are equal, which again, I think is an empowering idea. And this means that one harmony is not more and more fully or less and less fully a harmony than another. Can that which is neither more or less harmonized partake more or less of harmony, or does it do so equally? So he dismisses rather readily, I think, the idea of the soul being this harmony that only plays once. But then he goes on to this question that Seebe's raises: is the soul damaged every time it enters a new body? And he says, this is a more difficult question for him. He says, this is no unimportant problem that you raise, Seebe's, for it requires a thorough investigation of the cause of generation and destruction. And so, do we just assume that destruction happens naturally as soon as one is born? Or is there a continuing cause of generation and destruction? So is generation and destruction a cycle? And that kind of leads to what he talks about at the end of this section today at 96B to 97E. What is actually the cause of generation and destruction in the physical realm, of bodies? And just wondering, what are the thoughts about this? Is the soul something that is damaged by the body? Certainly Socrates has talked a lot about how the body confuses the soul, how the soul, he compares it to the soul looking through a cage, the body being this kind of cage, and the soul's looking through this cage, and the bars of the cage are obscuring its vision, misleading it, confusing it, bewildering it. In fact, at one point he says that the more the soul believes that the body is the cause of anything, that's just like riveting the body to the soul inseparably. There's actually one point where it's actually at 81D, where he talks about ghosts. Ghosts come back to life, or kind of are in this between world of life and death, because they are souls that have been so closely riveted to the body, so closely sewn into the body, because they can't separate the reality of the eternal kind of the realm of the forms versus this ever-changing realm of the body. And so these ghosts wander about. I actually found that a really interesting explanation for ghosts. So, is it, this idea of the cloak, that the body wearing this cloak that the soul makes, and how closely that cloak is worn and woven into the body is I thought it was an interesting question. Maybe we'll just go and look at that section. This whole idea of uncertainty in the order of uncertainty of order in the cause of things, from 96B to 97E. And maybe I'll just read this section here, because I find there's a really appealing piece of logic in here, and maybe this wisdom is, or part of wisdom is being able to apply logic to one's appetites, to spirit, and to reason. And it just was a really interesting piece of logic in this. So this starts at 96B, goes on to 97E. So read this. When I was a young man, I was wonderfully keen on that wisdom which they call natural science, for I thought it splendid to know the causes of everything, why it comes to be, why it perishes, and why it exists. I was often changing my mind in the investigation, in the first instance, of questions such as these. Are living creatures nurtured when heat and cold produce a kind of putrefaction, as some say? Do we think with our blood, or air, or fire, or none of these? And does the brain provide our senses of hearing and sight and smell, from which come memory and opinion, and from memory and opinion which has become stable comes knowledge? Then again, as I investigated how these things perish, and what happens to things in the sky and on the earth, finally I became convinced that I have no natural aptitude at all for that kind of investigation, and of this I will give you sufficient proof. This investigation made me quite blind, even to the things which I and others thought that I clearly knew before, so that I unlearned what I thought I knew before about many other things, and specifically about how men grew. I thought before that it was obvious to anybody that men grew through eating and drinking, for food adds flesh to flesh and bones to bones, and in the same way appropriate parts were added to all other parts of the body, so that the man grew from an earlier small bulk to a large bulk, and so a small man became big. This is what I thought then. Then further consider this. I thought my opinion was satisfactory, that when a large man stood by a small one, he was taller by a head, and so a horse was taller than a horse. Even clearer than this, I thought that 10 was more than 8, because 2 had been added, and that a 2-cubit length is larger than a cubit, because it surpasses it by half its length. So this seems logical so far. But then, this realm of things that are physical is not necessarily logical. And so he goes on with this particular bit of logic. I am far, by Zeus, from believing that I know the cause of any of these things. So the question is, what is the cause? I will not even allow myself to say that where one is added to one, either the one to which it is added or the one that is added becomes 2. Or that the one added and the one to which it is added becomes 2 because of the addition of the one to the other. I wonder that when each of them is separate from each other, each of them is 1, nor are they then 2, but that when they come near to one another, this is the cause of their becoming 2, the coming together and being placed closer to one another. Nor can I any longer be persuaded that when one thing is divided, this division is the cause of its becoming 2. For just now, the becoming of 2 was the opposite. At that time, it was their coming close together, and one was added to the other, but now it is because one is taken and separated from the other. So there's some interesting thoughts here where he's calling into question what is the cause of things. And here he's trying to answer CB's idea of, what is there a cause to the soul's being destroyed each time it enters into a body? Is that active entry into the body a cause of destruction? And so here he's talking about generation and destruction and what the cause of that is. And I'm just wondering, is there anything in here, there is some math here, 1 + 1 = 2. And I've divided the flow of in the text, it appears as, just regular paragraph flow. But here I've divided the kind of logical clauses here on the screen, between, in a way that we can see what he's saying about cause and effect here. And, he's saying here that he thought that he understood the causes of physical things. At the beginning, he says that he was wonderfully keen on that wisdom which they call natural science. So he's calling into question this idea of wisdom in natural science. In other words, wisdom in physics. Do we know the cause of physical things? And he's giving an example here of he doesn't even know the cause of how 2 comes from 1. I've got an example that I just did with these numbers. Let me just put that on the screen. Maybe we can take a look at that. So what I did was I put these questions on the right-hand side here in terms of inputs and outputs in a process. So any process would have to have at least 2 inputs, right? You can't have a process unless there's at least 2 things to process. And so here I put on the right-hand side the questions that he's raising at 96B to 97E. And I put it next to what is going to be the way signals transmit in the quantum computer. This is a qubit. And so in the logic of a qubit, 2 possible states can exist simultaneously. The state 1, which is down here at the bottom, and the state 0. And so what we have here is a sphere. It's a sphere with a triangle rotating in it. Okay, and there's 3 axes, the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. And they are equal. So there is the equal in this diagram here of the qubit. And they're equal at this point in the middle where x equals y equals z. So there's that idea of equal. And there's the idea of opposites. So it can be in opposite states, 1 and 0, but these opposite states happen simultaneously. And this is what gives, or what will give, the quantum computer such incredible power, because things can exist in two states at the same time, both 1 and 0, and with this point of equivalence always. And I thought this question, or these questions that he asked from 96b to 97c, were particularly resonated with me in terms of this architecture of the way signals are going to transmit in the quantum computer because of this simultaneous being in two states. So the questions he asks are, does the output the output of 2 comes from 2 inputs, 1 plus 1. So 1 exists first, and then 1 is added second and produces an output of 2. So 3 questions. Does the output result from the first input, or does it result from the second input? In other words, is this first input the driver of the output of 2, or is the second input the driver of the output of 2? Or does the output result from both inputs? So in other words, would you get the output 2 only if you combined the 2 things at the same time? So the question is, which is first and which is second, or is it a combination that results in the output of 2? And then he goes on to say, does each input in its own represent 1 without regard to the fact that there are 2 of them? So in other words, you've got 2 inputs, but how can each of them be 1 if combined they represent 2? And then 3, does the proximity of the inputs 1 and 1 at x, y, and 0 and z here in the qubit diagram here, the proximity here right at the point that they join, the equal, does that proximity cause them to become 2? And then lastly, if the single input is divided into its equal, if the single output is divided into its equal inputs, is that the cause of becoming 2? Which would then contradict 1, 2, and 3 of the questions that were just asked previously. And just wondering if that kind of way of seeing this logic that he's presenting, whether that makes any kind of sense in the way we approach things logically, particularly when there's all of these possibilities and probabilities that we're dealing with. Or does anybody see any other logic in that question? And how would we apply wisdom in the context of designing algorithms for this type of scenario where there are 2 possible states that exist at the same time? So what kind of, there can be knowledge applied. I think as we've talked about, knowledge is, information generally. I think we've reached a conclusion maybe on that point. But then how do we take, maybe as Jose was explaining, how do we take that knowledge and apply it to produce some sort of desired output? And how would it be possible if we relied just on what we could see? How would it be possible to understand what's going to happen at the same time simultaneously when you've got multiple possibilities? I really like this piece of logic here. And it really talks about this idea of generation and regeneration. So I'll just call into attention these paragraphs from 71A to B, where he says, this is from the previous section that we read 2 weeks ago, 71A to B. He says, all things come to be in this way, opposites from opposites. Between each of those pairs of opposites, there are 2 processes, from the one to the other, and then again from the other to the first. Between the larger and the smaller, there is increase and decrease. So we can see, the pairs, the 0 and the 1, the 2 potential outputs here. the 0 and the 1. So those are the pairs. Those could be opposites, opposite states. 0 is non-being, 1 is being. We could think of it that way, maybe in terms of the way computers work. Signal on or signal off, signal exists or signal doesn't exist, being or non-being. And so he says between each of these pairs of opposites, there are two processes, from the one to the other, and then again from the other to the first. Between the larger and the smaller, there's increase and decrease. And then he goes on to say at 71C, therefore, if these are opposites, they come to be from one another, and there are two processes of generation between the two. And because we've got a sphere here, we can see that, you can go around the sphere one way, you can go around it the other way. There's this just constant generation and regeneration, and then you can have destruction and generation. And this is where I think that, because Plato was a geometer, I wonder, how much of that was behind some of what he said and the priorities that he put on some of the details in his dialogues. I'm not sure that people really focus on the geometry part of Plato, but I found particularly geometric logic in this section from 96b to 97e. Any thoughts on that? JK?
So are we assuming that that this kind of mathematical logic can be applied to the deepest levels of philosophical thinking about arriving? Does this correlate with wisdom? Can mathematics be correlated with wisdom of how to live, or how to think about these questions of how to live? So I'm not sure if they can be correlated. I mean, at some level, of knowledge and understanding, they do correlate. So we could program computers using this kind of logic and mathematics. But does that? Are we assuming that could approximate what it is to be human, or to achieve a kind of human wisdom? So if that's the case, in computers, you could program computers to achieve this kind of human wisdom, right?
Well, I think that is an excellent question, and maybe it's the question of our time. Is a computer capable on its own of wisdom, or is a computer only capable of calculation? And we just recall from the Republic, where Socrates said that the first order of knowledge for a philosopher is of calculation. And here in the Phaedo, he's saying we need to find the equal. And so there is some sort of consistency in the themes that Plato is presenting in terms of knowledge. But, as you asked, JK, is it a question of just simply being able to calculate? Or is it then, maybe as Jose was implying earlier, then being able to apply that calculation for some purpose? And the purpose could be determined maybe by our appetites, by our spirit, or by our reason, which are the three parts of the soul that Socrates presented in the Republic. So is calculation in itself something of wisdom, or is calculation the basis of knowledge that could be used in wisdom? And again, it's that idea of finding the beginning and the end of something, the two limits of a thing, and then finding that point of equal in the middle, where there is, maybe in this diagram, maybe this is the potential is the equal point, where the x-axis equals the y-axis equals the z-axis. You've got this equivalence here. And, as you just think about this sphere with these 3 points in the middle being equal, maybe that's the real potential in this. And so the purpose of knowledge is to find that point of potential, and then to apply it to some to some end purpose, and that's where the wisdom would come in. I don't know what is that kind of image helpful? Again, going back to that question of what is wisdom. Maybe the one thing is that mathematics, I see it as producing some sort of certainty of knowledge. We know that 2 + 2 = 4, and there's no uncertainty about that. Whereas the physical world, there's lots of uncertainty. And in the reasoning process, there's lots of uncertainty. So, as you asked, JK, is mathematics maybe a way of grounding ourselves, providing ourselves some basis of certainty and understanding the limits of anything. In this case, the limits are denoted by 0 at the top of the sphere and 1 at the bottom of the sphere. And if this is the equivalence, if we understand where this equivalence is between the being of something at 1 and the non-being of something at 0, is this point of equivalence the point of potential that is really the point that the soul is looking for in anything? And maybe this sphere with a triangle in it is equivalent to a form. Jose, your thoughts?
Like when we study the Republic in the divided line, the mathematics, the geometry, is in a lower level than the dialectic. So my feeling is that like wisdom, you cannot reach wisdom by mathematics. You have to reach wisdom by dialectic. So to get to the eternal, like a truth and the justice, etc. To me, I think I don't think that you can get with mathematics. You have to go with the less level that is dialectic, at least for Plato.
Mm-hmm. By dialectic, I think, the definition of dialectic is, finding the first principle of something.
Well, this goes to the previous, at least my concept, for the previous question about I think this theory forms, etc. is a whole theory that encompasses several things. So for Plato, there are 2 worlds. One is the invisible or the eternal or the truth, etc. And we have the other world that is the physical world. And the only thing that is common is the soul.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing that travels between the 2 worlds is the soul. So the soul comes from the forms, comes to the humans. Now, how is this knowledge of the forms transmitted from the world of the forms to the sensible world? Is through the soul and through the recollection, because this is the only way that we have to access. There is no other way to access the world of the forms. Mm-hmm. So the recollection is our only tool. So now, the way that at least that Plato says that in order to get to recollection, I think this is the dialectic. The dialectic. No, I don't think that is getting, well, maybe it's getting to first principle, but is the reasoning with questions and answers. Remember that in his academia, the way that they teach things, it wasn't like teaching, it was like questions and answers. So the students, they questions, answers, and you get to it. This is the process of recollection. Because according to Plato, we have the knowledge in our souls, but we have to recollect them. And the process of recollection, you do the process of recollection, the optimum process, I guess, via the dialectic. So this is at the end, this is the ultimate method to get wisdom. So now he teaches a lot of mathematics as well in the academia. but this is a preparation. Remember, in the Republic, they study mathematics, I think, from 20 to 30 years old, and after that, they started studying dialectic. So dialectic is the latest way to get wisdom. Mathematics is a preparation, gives you our reasoning, but it's not the way to get to. I think it's not the way to get to wisdom, according to Plato.
I like the way you put that the soul is common to both worlds and accesses use of recollection to maybe combine the elements of both worlds. And I guess in dialogue we can find we can ensure that we are defining things the same way, I think, and then with that common definition, we can then look for the first principle. But I think the problem comes about, as he's pointing out in Phaedo, is all of this confusion that the body causes. And so somehow we need to transcend that confusion. And you need to look for that kind of pure point where there is no uncertainty. And that doesn't exist in the physical world.
But when you die only.
Yeah. Well, when you find what is actually pure, but I guess, how you approach that kind of pure knowledge is, at least as I understand what he's saying in both Phaedo and the Republic, is that it's understanding the equivalence of things. So you've got dialogue has allowed you to establish a common definition. Dialectic is where you look for the first principle of something, and looking for the first principle is looking for the point that is kind of the middle of the form of a thing, which is between its two limits. And the number 2, I think, is maybe why he's used this in this particular section. So if a thing has 2 limits of being and non-being, and you find the point that is exactly in the middle, which is neither being nor non-being, and that's when you're in the present, where nothing is, everything is becoming, nothing exists, nothing doesn't exist. You're kind of in this middle phase, and you've got this potential of finding something, but you need to have some degree of certainty about it. And so I think that's why in the Republic, he said the first order of business of a philosopher is to understand number and calculation. And that allows you to know the limits of a thing, because in the physical realm, you're dealing with limits. Things exist in components. Each component has a limit. And so these composite things that you're dealing with all have limits, and you need to know where something begins, where something ends, and then exactly what's in the middle, because that's the point that you're going to need to deal with as you're trying to apply knowledge of the thing to in a fashion that is wise, that will get you the outcome that is going to be good, not just for the moment, but for all time. That's kind of the way I'm seeing it, but I don't know if this makes any sense. To me, it's the logic that he's followed from the Republic. And then we looked at Philebus, where he talked about the unlimited and the limit, which, again, to me seems to be, the unlimited is, again, the realm of the invisible, the realm of the non-composite. There are no limits in that. And he talked about the limited, which, again, is in the realm of the physical. And then he says you combine both the unlimited and the limited. You apply a mixture, you apply them in a mixture, and you add a cause, and then you get your outcomes. I think it's, again, here he's talking about cause. And this was brought out, by C.B.'s argument that the birth of the soul in a body causes the soul to be destroyed. And Socrates says, no, this is just a continual process of generation and destruction. It's just continual regeneration, going around in that circle. But I kind of see this consistency of logic that he's applied in these 3 dialogues, the Republic, Philebus, and and Phaedo. And is it wise? Does this help us? When we've got this incredible power that the human species is now developing with the quantum computer. I've spoken about this many times. The people who have followed this series know that this is a pastime of mine, is understanding what's happening in the world of quantum computing. And this is something that is coming up. Some say it might be 20 years, others say it might be 5 years from now, where the quantum computer becomes active and can actually be applied to practical purposes. But whatever happens, it will be very powerful, like many, many thousands of times faster than our current computers. And the question is, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to apply our knowledge of computing? What kind of inputs are we going to apply, and what kind of outputs are we going to generate? And do we have the wisdom to do that in a way that does not cause destruction, but in a way that causes some sort of regeneration and will produce outcomes that are not good just at the moment, but also good through all time, not just for our generation, but for future generations to come. And it's not just in computing, but it's in anything that we do, in any technology that we develop. What kind of wisdom is applied to ensure that the technology serves us rather than us serving the technology. And again, I thought these questions that Socrates asked at 96b to 97e in terms of causes, I just found these questions particularly striking. I thought about it. It seems natural that 1 + 1 = 2, but there's many ways of looking at it. And we thought that, for example, it was thought for a long time, for thousands of years, that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then we discovered it wasn't. And so how do we ensure that the knowledge that we think we have is actually true and correct knowledge? And is it through numbering calculation, as Socrates said in the Republic, or is it through some other means? And if it's through some other means, by what other means would we use, or what other means would we use to ensure that our knowledge is accurate? If it's not numbering calculation, what other means would we use? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that question.
Well, some philosophers have posited that nature itself is limitless and infinite in its creative capacities, and that there is in nature itself there is a kind of like the ultimate soul, or the original impetus, right? And and then we can't divorce ourselves from nature, and that's if we do, that's we have problems. We begin to think that we are we have conquered nature, and it's a kind of binary thinking that might be misleading. I don't know if the computer science can incorporate that kind of understanding. Yeah.
It's a powerful thought. I mean, nature, we are part of nature. I think there can be no doubt about that. Certainly our bodies are part of nature. And then our minds are part of a universe that includes invisible things like the mind. So both of those are woven into the universe. The thing about nature, when I think about it, nature continually regenerates itself. Nature does not need humanity to exist. Humans need nature to exist, right? But right. Without humans, nature would just always exist as it always has and always will, right?
Yeah.
we're at this point of our existence where we are causing great destruction to nature. But, we have, with tools like the quantum computer, we will have incredibly powerful tools which can serve to preserve nature if we choose to do that. But if we choose not to do that and use it for destructive purposes, then we will cause nature not to exist anymore, and that will be our fault. Mm-hmm. And again, what kind of wisdom are we going to use in this question? Who's going to decide to what end the quantum computer is going to be used? And not just the quantum computer, but all of these other technologies that are being developed. There's some who want us to go into the metaverse. What's going to be in the metaverse? What will we confront in the metaverse? Will it be good? Will it be bad? Whose ideas are going to shape that? I just find this conception of the soul that Socrates presents in the Phaedo is so powerful and so important. I think it's, we understand a lot about physics and all of the sciences. We understand a lot about the how of it, I think, but maybe not the why of it. Why do we do these things? And why do we make one choice versus the other? All of that's happening, the body is not causing that to happen. That's all being caused by what's inside the body, the invisible soul. And how does this invisible soul cause these, what is it basing these decisions on? Joel, but you can call me Joe. What are your thoughts?
Well, I just kind of am hanging on one of your last phrases. You say the how of it, but not the why of it. Are we convinced there is a why to it? I mean, you're operating. I'm not suggesting that your thoughts are wrong in any way, but I think we have to consider the opposite in order to arrive at a midpoint. If there is a why, maybe there is no why, in which case we're dealing with infinity at both ends. So we'll never come to the decision. But at some point, at each point, we will be making decisions collectively and as individuals as to where we're going. Mm-hmm. And that will determine, we think, at least in some measure, the future. And to what end, we have no idea. I mean, we may have an idea in the very short term, but we have no idea where the ultimate end is. So perhaps we should just revert to traditional forms, and instead of studying philosophy on Sunday, we should return to our various religious institutions for these 2 hours. I'm speaking somewhat facetiously, I'm sure you realize.
You raise the question, I think, and that's very valid. It's why is why important? Is it important? And to what extent do our souls have some sort of agency in this process? To what extent can our souls shape the future? Do our souls have the ability to bend time? Or are we just travelers on this predestined road of time? And that's maybe, I'd like to think that the soul has the power to shape the future. And I think we've seen through the history of humanity that we have shaped the future. I mean, we've completely reformed the surface of an entire planet. We've built cities, we've diverted rivers, we've done, all of these things. And now we're going out into space and about to shape space. So, but maybe, as you say, to what extent can we actually do that? And are there limits to that? So, good question. Jane, what are your thoughts?
I guess I'm going to a little bit backtrack to the very maybe beginning of the discussion. I really like the question of why. So I think that is a key crucial point, because asking the question why would imply in a way that there is a bigger picture of things and a sort of intrinsic general logic in the way the world is set up. So from my understanding of where modern science is, the sort of cause and effect of the big picture are taken out of the picture, and we're all about functionality nowadays. So if it works, then that's great. We don't really care about the why, presuming that there is no bigger why, and it is, like Joel mentioned, if I understood him correctly, no point in asking that why, because it's that question is redundant in a way. And I think that asking the question why, it brings us to the thought of wisdom and what it is. Asking the question why is what wisdom is. So knowledge is a collection of pieces of information that we piece together. We acquire knowledge a lot of the times empirically, but I think what wisdom is the ability to sort of transcend knowledge. So we're able to discover intricate, sophisticated patterns that are not attainable if we're going empirically, because empirically it's sort of like trying to collect all the berries in a huge forest. It's impossible. But when you're going for this intricate, sophisticated ability to understand and view patterns, that is true wisdom, because you're able to acquire knowledge that is beyond the empirical, if that makes sense. And getting back to what mathematics is, the way that I view, well, I'm very weak in mathematics, unfortunately, but the way that I view it, it's definitely a group of disciplines that I'd like to conquer at least a little bit in a way, because I find that mathematics is a great way to discipline the mind. It helps the person to develop very sturdy and fundamental logic. That is crucial for a person when you're going into philosophical dialectics. It's you're always on the brinks of philosophizing, just talking about things using big words and making it sound nice, but are you really getting to something crucial? And in order to be able to get to something fundamentally important and real in a metaphysical sense, you need that fundamental hardcore logic. And I think the perfect way to do that is mathematics. So mathematics is this sort of model where you can practice your heavy duty logic, and then you can put it into good practice in more metaphysical fields like philosophy. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
You said so many powerful things there. Starting with the point is, is there intrinsic general logic in the way things are? I'd like to think yes, because I think it's too disturbing to think otherwise. That we exist in this realm where there is no logic, or where there is no fundamental logic, where everything is shifting. And maybe that's the point that Socrates was talking about at 90C. That those who spend all their time studying contradiction in the end believe themselves to have become very wise, and that they alone have understood that there is no soundness or reliability in any object or in any argument, but that all that exists simply fluctuates up and down. It's maybe, I don't know, it's like maybe the approach of Heraclitus, maybe something like that, that nothing is nothing is certain, everything, we're just continuing on this shifting sand. And then, then you asked, are we all about functionality, or is there some way that we can change things? And then transcending knowledge, I think, was a very interesting way of defining wisdom. Maybe that it's that transcending. And then you talked about patterns, and it reminds me again of that discussion we had when we talked about the syllabus and that machine learning that misidentified the two Black people as gorillas, because machines aren't good at seeing patterns, and humans are still very good at seeing patterns, far better than machines still. And that's why there was a number of years ago where they were looking for patterns in galaxies with the like Hubble telescope images, and instead of trying to put these images into computers and having computers identify the patterns, they decided that wouldn't work. So they actually created this experiment. It was a public science experiment where it was called Galaxy Zoo, and they put the images on the internet and people could just go in, and hundreds of thousands of people did, and they identified some very interesting patterns in galaxies that the machines couldn't otherwise pick out. So and maybe that has a lot to do with understanding the forms of things. I think this, if we understand the beginning and the end of something and what a thing is, then we can, apply those same things using mathematics or some other function to find those patterns. So really, if knowledge of number and calculation is the first order of business for a philosopher, how do we get philosophers to be comfortable with that? I think there is this general discomfort with that, and certainly there was on my part before I took up this some years back. I had a very bad experience in math in high school, very bad experience, and it terrified me a bit. But somehow I got into it through geometry, actually. And I found that when I started to see the patterns in geometry, like the pattern in the qubit image on my screen, I started to see the mathematical relationships between things, and it sort of became second nature. But I think it's something that maybe philosophy now, the way it's approached without mathematics generally, may be very different from the way it was approached in Plato's time, where a philosopher had to understand mathematics and geometry and all sorts of other sciences at the same time. And maybe, I don't know if that's the way we need to take philosophy now, but I certainly find understanding mathematics and geometry really does help with logic. And it wasn't, certainly Bertrand Russell, I mentioned earlier, he did a very extensive, was in his Principia, where he did use mathematics very extensively to find a number of very important philosophical principles. So maybe there's more of that needed, but maybe more in a way that is accessible and relatable to people, so that people don't think that it's, you need a PhD in understanding all of the formulas before you can really understand what mathematics are saying. Maybe it is as simple as Socrates is saying in those passages from 96 to 97. Does 1 + 1 = 2? Like, why is 2 is 2 because of the first one, or is it because of the second one, or because of the combination, or because it's divided? Maybe it's just general conceptual questions like that will lead to some sort of understanding. So lots of interesting thoughts and questions today, and looking forward to finishing the rest of Phaedo in 2 weeks. So I thank everybody for attending today, and so many good thoughts and ideas, and looking forward to seeing what kind of conclusions we reach at the end of the Phaedo, and then how that takes us into Parmenides, which will come after that. And I think there's some very particular lines of logic in there that deal with one value in particular, the value 1. And maybe there's some interesting mathematics of the value 1 that we can find that don't require a PhD in mathematics, but just require the application of some logic. So looking forward to that. So thank you all for attending today. We'll end the recorded session now, but again, as always, I invite anybody who wants to stay for Plato's Cafe, a half an hour casual discussion on what we just talked about, or Plato in general, or philosophy in general. So thank you all for a fascinating discussion today, and looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.